Welcome to Wavelengths, a podcast with Amphenol Broadband Solutions.
Smart cities at large. I mentioned this in the intro, but when we're talking about one of the biggest sort of future-focused, forward-looking trends that are shaping the development of city infrastructure, which includes, of course, fiber and broadband and internet access, but also the downstream nodes and services that take advantage of that would be smart cities, right? This is a major trend. And a lot of it is, I don't know, sometimes headline grabbing, right? But it can be difficult to gauge exactly how developed these larger smart city initiatives are for the practical end user to a degree where you could confidently say, I live in a smart city, right? You start to get a few of them, a few of these services deployed in ways that don't hit the customer or the end user, the citizen here. These are going to be more like back-end municipal deployments of smart city metering infrastructure, safety and environmental efficiency projects, right, that leverage IoT technology to improve overall performance of a city, et cetera. I'm curious how you're seeing the smart city trend shape the conversation around the deployment of or improvement of fiber broadband, right? Are these things motivating each other, right? Especially with maybe a little bit of distance between what the consumer feels when they go to sign up for internet access versus what they feel when they're trying to relate to this larger, smart city trend, right? To me, it feels like there's a little bit of distance there. And so maybe the smart city and broadband connection is happening at a much higher scale in a way that isn't quite making its way down to the internet subscriber yet. But I'm curious, I might be wrong. What do you think on that?
I certainly don't think we're going to wake up on a specific Tuesday and get an announcement. Oh, your city is now a smart city.
Smart, yeah, right, yeah.
Congratulations, you've been upgraded. I certainly think that this is a much more subtle thing. I imagine that when rural electrification was happening, I wasn't around. But when that was happening, and then that started in major cities first, and even when urban electrification was going on, I imagine that this was this was an elongated process, right, where things started to happen slowly at first, and you would notice street lamps, and you would notice a lot of these things that would be like, oh, this is really great that we have this now, and more buildings were electrified, and you would be these things would become slowly more commonplace until before you know it, you would just come to expect them, right? And I think in a lot of ways, the concept of a smart city is going to be very similar, but I think it will happen on perhaps a more, a faster timeline, I suppose. I think we'll probably see this happen quite quickly in many areas, but I still think that the differences will be a bit more subtle and yet still extremely profound, right? When a lot of people hear the term smart cities, they definitely think about the flashy stuff, and that's great, right? I think about it too, right. Like truly self-driving cars. We've been hearing about this for 20 years, and obviously longer than that, but certainly in a realistic sense, we've been hearing about that concept for a long time. You mentioned at the start of this things like AI-powered traffic management, traffic lights, city grid management. Some of these robotic delivery drones that we're seeing all over LA and other cities, right, that are sort of just driving Uber Eats food along the sidewalk. All of these things are evidence of smart cities, right? But it's really, I think, again, the revolution part of this is going to happen, and it's going to be in a much more subtle way at first, right? Like what you're saying, the idea that the consumer doesn't really experience these things firsthand at first, right? The internet that you have at home is certainly going to be a component of this, like you said, with the Internet of Things revolution and the amount of connected devices in a home ballooning, right? We'll certainly see a lot of these sort of connected applications impact the consumer in their own home. But a lot of this infrastructure, a lot of the things you kind of imagine when you think about a smart city, the infrastructure in some cases exists now, right? We do have in many cities, what I'd call a basic nervous system, right? Our city infrastructure in many cases handles traffic signals, traffic lights, water flow, power gets distributed. The smart city, dynamic is really moving toward a sort of a much more complex digital nervous system that includes not only the city infrastructure that, again, the average person might never see nor think about. It just needs to work, and also the end user's connection right at their home. These two technologies and these two use cases will eventually merge. A good example of this is right now, if there's a water main break outside your house, right? The city finds out when water starts flooding the street, and you call and you complain, and you have to, someone will come out and fix it, hopefully, right? In a true smart city style scenario, you can imagine an infrastructure that not only detects that problem before it happens potentially, but also automatically reroutes water pressure, alerts repair crews, adjusts traffic patterns to accommodate those repairs, and notify affected businesses. All of these things that sort of directly ties into the concept of a smart city, but is really this larger thing that's happening only when the infrastructure development is ubiquitous across both the consumer's connection, but also this sort of larger citywide infrastructure rollout.
Well, and speaking of infrastructure, it might be said that when it gets down to the city level, the regional or even state level, something like smart city infrastructure investment versus fiber broadband investment could compete for similar dollars. Now, obviously, they are intrinsically linked. There really is no smart city development without proper connectivity. But I'm curious if you're seeing one push the other more, right? So, for example, are we seeing a realization that smart city development will be hampered without proper investment in affordable wired or wireless broadband access, as that being a motivator for, hey, we have this smart city vision, we don't have the infrastructure, therefore let's invest in it? Or is it more of the other way around, where we're seeing the priority focus on investing in the foundational connectivity infrastructure, and as that improves, you start to see the ability to say, hey, okay, now we can actually, take seriously this idea of deploying major smart city services, whether that's for, back-end infrastructure needs or citizen-facing positive services and solutions. Is one motivating the other, or is it hard to even, connect those dots? Are they happening at such a scale that it's just sort of a chicken and the egg scenario?
Well, I think it's a bit of both. The beauty of a connection like fiber is that it truly does inform both of those things, right? It does service both of those interests. And this is another example of why at BroadbandNow we're particularly interested in tracking not just where this connectivity exists, but where it's truly robust enough. And in this case, we're talking about where fiber exists, right, to support this kind of deep integration between the things that the consumer would use at their home and also the things they might take advantage of in their community, right? Yes, this fundamentally, a smart city isn't about having fast internet, right? It's about having this sort of reliable but also redundant, hyper low latency connectivity that can support eventually millions of devices making split-second decisions across an entire metro area, right? And so, fortunately, we are blessed with this amazing technology called fiber optic cables, which do allow for all of that to become possible. And we've had this technology for a long time, but obviously the intricacies of how we connect it all is still something we're working on. But yeah, I think ultimately the goal, especially in cities where the technology is there, the motivation is there, and certainly the funding is there. There is a beautiful marriage of motivation when it comes to deploying this technology and making it future proof, because the benefits for something like a smart city, it goes so far beyond just the obvious, right, of making a city feel more attractive to live in and making the community better, right? There's a tremendous cost saving component of this. It can potentially save people's lives, thousands of lives over the course of years, with increased traffic management and public safety efforts and telehealth and so many different elements of this, right? So I think there is a concerted motivation. I think the issue is certainly simpler whenever you just can say that one technology can truly do this. And it isn't just one technology, right? It's fiber that powers all this, but it is ultimately building out the other element, right? Which is a very dense grid of technologies like 5G and other wireless protocols that will help support this massive network. I mean, we're talking about having everyone's washing machine and toaster and traffic light and bus stop and anything you could imagine would be connected to this hypothetical network, and increasingly is connected to networks, right? Even in our own homes. But all of these things, that the technology that actually delivers that service, it might be a different sort of supplemental technology, but it all flows back to fiber in the end. That's the superhighway that powers whatever else we build on top of those networks. So I think in that sense, both network providers that are building out in individual communities for consumers, and networks that are also providing the backbone in these urban environments, they're really united in one main goal.
Let's turn our focus now to the rural side of things. When we start to compare the motivating forces that are pushing for improved broadband access and just improved broadband in general, right? Better connectivity, better speeds, better prices. In rural versus city areas, there are, of course, some unique use cases, but a lot of the motivations are similar. It's just the scale that looks different and the investments that look different. Whereas in a city, it might be, let's upgrade our existing infrastructure. In rural settings, it might be, we need to establish fresh infrastructure that either hasn't been updated in years or just doesn't exist. And we need to lay the foundational fiber to help reach communities with the level of internet that has become colloquially understood as standard. And so I'm curious, how much of a disparity you see between the trends motivating the development of broadband in cities compared to the trends motivating the development of broadband in rural areas. Are they really that different, or is it really just down to scope and scale of investment rather than, major motivating trends shaping that development?
Yeah, well, I think they're ultimately similar in terms of the aspirational goal, right? We want everyone to be able to take advantage of the same benefits and the same use cases. But I do think that they are playing two different games, right? One is, again, we have this incredible technology. Let's make it better. Let's revolutionize the city. Let's take advantage of the sci-fi use cases of tomorrow, today. The other is, let's be able to go to the doctor. Let's be able to, actually find a job outside of the, 30-mile radius of our home, right? Let's be able to allow our kids access to higher levels of education, right? It's a bit of a more fundamental game being played that, again, some people might have been playing for 10 years now on their connection that they've enjoyed, like you and I probably, right? And so I think, it's hard to ignore that there is that disparity, right? And again, that goes back to what I was saying before. In many cases, because if you can imagine someone who has never really been able to take advantage of these technologies, you don't have the sort of lifetime of baseline knowledge for what it can do for you. And so there's this other issue of digital literacy, again, going back to this concept where even if we had the fiber gun, and we deployed fiber overnight to every home in America, we would still have another problem on our hands, which is this massive adoption gap, right? We would have this massive adoption and literacy gap where, just giving people a connection that can do all these things isn't enough, right? We need to be able to catch people up and give them tools that empower them to utilize these connections to have better lives, right? Part of that problem is certainly in the education and the messaging component of this, right? If we want people to truly take advantage of the this so-called fourth industrial revolution and all of the transformative things that are coming, we need them to be aware that it is coming, right? We need them to be aware that these technologies exist and that they can have such a profound impact on their lives. And so I think, again, that sort of highlights the different game being played in these areas. Is it's really, there's multiple objectives in both cases, but in the case of rural communities, it is certainly this, first we're trying to, stop the bleeding. We're trying to make sure people can actually have this technology and actually utilize it. The second issue is we want to make sure that they're well equipped to use it once we've solved that infrastructure problem, and also that the way we solve it keeps supporting those use cases, right? We don't want to pat ourselves on the back and say we've wired all of America if the technology that we use to wire, say, the last 20 million of us is not going to be relevant in 10 years, right? I don't consider that having solved the digital divide. We're really just kicking the can down the road.
I'm curious if you're seeing any creative ways that rural regions or municipalities are putting a little extra coal on the fire to motivate the expansion of broadband access. I know we see in some communities things like esports, for example, and a demand for proper connectivity so the kids can game, being a motivating force that's actually sort of pushing the region to speed up, to accelerate the expansion of and the improvement of broadband access, right? Which is just one kind of a large example there. But I'm curious if anything else comes to mind based on your own research, right? Ways that you're seeing rural environments, kind of muscle their way into getting the right funding or, putting pressure on decision makers to speed up these developments.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned gaming. I'd say that that's another example of a really zoomed in example of what I was describing, right? Where there's almost this not only technological but cultural gap, right? In terms of the ways that we rely on our broadband connection, right? I grew up in a very rural area, and that obviously I'm 31. I grew up during the sort of advent of the internet, and certainly kind of grew up alongside it. And I think as I sort of moved into an area that actually had internet, it was certainly like a whole new world was open to me, right? And there was so many things culturally that I was able to connect with friends and other people about that. Even today, someone in a rural community might not have those same cultural touch points. And I think certainly the desire to be a part of that from a youth standpoint is just indicative of this larger issue, right? Which is that these people who don't have access to a robust connection are truly left behind societally and culturally in many ways. And that goes beyond just gaming, right? This is also access to culture writ large, right? This larger concept of this evolving conversation that happens online, however chaotic it might be, being able to participate in it in the first place. We see this play out in politics. We see it play out in city planning and in, again, technology and certainly, media and entertainment. All of these elements, these are all conversations and elements of culture that we all sort of take for granted. But there are millions of people that don't have that same level of access to this conversation, right? Aren't a part of it, and their voices are incredibly valuable and would be able to contribute to this conversation in a way they certainly can. And so I certainly, I think that this is something that again highlights the cost beyond dollars of not closing this divide, right? We're talking about a future generation of learners and young professionals who will be coming into a world that looks potentially profoundly different, right? If you grow up in a hyper rural area and you move to a city in 2035 and you've never utilized the internet to the fullest potential, will you be able to find a job in an economy that's virtually all digital, right? Will you be able to take advantage of these sort of transformative technologies like AI? Will you be able to relate to your friends and coworkers, culturally with a lot of the things that maybe you didn't have access to? This all, this sounds so intuitive to someone who's had this technology their whole lives, right? Who's been a part of the internet and sort of seen it change and grow. But there are just simply millions of us that don't have that reference point, right? And it's a problem today. but it will become a massive problem in the future.
So to wrap things up, and thank you so much for all the analysis and commentary, Tyler. I want to end things on an actionable note for these decision makers that we're talking about here, right? The ones that are feeling some of the pressures to align their communities with the major trends that, like you said, are setting cultural standards as well as technological standards for quality of life in 21st century United States. Speaking of 21st century, right, you yourself and many have called broadband a 21st century utility, right? We need to treat it the same as electricity, water, trash services, right? It is what it is. It's a foundational utility. However, like we've broken down, while things are improving in terms of access, there's still a lot of work left to do. And, if we talked about broadband access and quality in the same way that we talked about electricity, right? Last year, only 50% of states had access to affordable electricity. I feel like we'd be having a different kind of cultural conversation around the status of our nation. You know what I mean? So I'm curious, when we talk about broadband in this light, what are some actionable steps that you would recommend that cities or rural areas should take in 2025 to operationalize this movement, right? And to treat broadband like a 21st century utility, right? What can they be doing to actually put the proper pressure behind access, improvements, as well as speed, cost, and just general service improvements, right, to match the needs of the time?
Well, this goes back to what we were talking about at the beginning of this conversation, but it's impossible to ignore the elephant in the room, which is the BEAD grant process right now.
Right.
Again, this is a once in a generation funding opportunity that is being administered directly by states through the NTIA. The money is starting to change hands this year, as you mentioned. So I think, again, more than anything, I want to call out and really sort of shout out that the state broadband offices, many of which I've spoken to over the last 2 years, many of which were newly established and have their first task is dealing with a mountain of paperwork for dealing with, how they're going to distribute this funding, how they're going to make sure that it makes sense for their constituents on the ground. And I think what we're seeing is something that is very encouraging to me is this unprecedented level of local collaboration with state regulators and the state broadband offices, right? We're seeing this, individual cities and constituents getting involved in a way that we've never seen really with broadband. It's really largely been out of, certainly individual city, but definitely state hands in general, right? We've had this federal funding push and this federally led strategy for the past decade plus. This is the first time we're seeing a tactic shift, right? That's really starting to play out in many of these areas. So I would, most of the cities are aware of this, but I would just really encourage people to really sort of take advantage of that collaborative environment that's being fostered at the state level now, because ultimately, again, these offices are the best, the best source of truth when it comes to what's actually plaguing residents on the ground, right? The areas that are true broadband deserts, they know better than the federal data, right? In many cases, they have more granular data. They have boots on the ground reporting that can showcase where these areas are and where the money needs to go to be most effective, right? And we're also, I also want to highlight that there are communities taking really innovative approaches to closing this divide in areas where the private sector has largely failed to do so, right? Something I've championed for a decade plus now and will continue to is this concept of municipal broadband, right? This concept of municipally powered broadband, where communities and electric co-ops and municipalities as a whole will go in and build out their own infrastructure, and in many cases run it themselves, sometimes lease it to other providers, but essentially build and manage their own networks and not wait for a provider to come in and do it for them. That this was originally during the Biden administration, a key component of the BEAD grants actually was, encouraging this sort of community network building and this community network deployment. The FCC as a whole, it's a bit of a can of worms, but, subject to changing administrations, the sort of temperature on this topic tends to change. Certainly right now, and in a Republican-led FCC, that tends to be more pushback against these networks. But I advocate for them wholeheartedly. I think they're a wonderful solution. They're not a perfect solution. They certainly don't work for every community. But I would definitely encourage, communities who are, considering this route to take a look at some of the cities that have been massively successful deploying their own infrastructure. Everyone points to cities like Chattanooga, Tennessee, but for good reason. They have a network there that's been in operation, EPB, for over a decade now, providing, fiber service that was so ahead of its time then and still ahead of its time now and still being upgraded, to some of these multi-gigabit connections that you were mentioning. So, again, I think we're right here at the doorstep of a foundational moment, when it comes to closing the digital divide, where we have an opportunity that we've never had before to really allow individual stakeholders, individual cities and municipalities a voice in this conversation for how this money gets used. And as plans are approved now and money starts changing hands with some of these providers, I think over the next several years, we will really see and be able to grade ourselves on how well we're utilizing this funding.
Yeah, I mean, I find it telling that after all these years of hosting the Wavelengths podcast, we're still talking BEAD. And I think, I think it is, again, just reflecting that you're right. This is a critical opportunity to take advantage of this funding. When we were talking about it years ago, it was the idea of, how are they going to roll out the funds and, what are the huge sort of visions that we have for the net result of all of these funds applied across the United States. But now we're in the nitty-gritty and the reality of BEAD funding, which is there's a lot of dollars out there. They're being deployed at the state level. But seeing the fruits of BEAD funding is going to take a lot of coordination, and it's going to take a lot of hands on deck and some proactivity, that's for sure. And the right advocates pushing for said funding to be deployed in the right regions. And so we're in the action stage, which is exciting, but also a heavy weight for the industry to carry. So as we continue to keep an eye on how BEAD will shape the development of both rural and city broadband access and infrastructure deployment, we'll definitely be turning to Tyler again for more analysis. But for now, Tyler, I think that wraps things up. Thank you so much for your time today, all of your analysis and your perspectives. You have a pretty unique and storied, set of roots in the community. And so it's always a pleasure getting to tap into your thought leadership. So thank you again, everyone. Again, we've been chatting with Tyler Cooper. He's editor-in-chief at BroadbandNow. Tyler, if folks want to get in touch, they want to tap into more of your research, more of your analysis, where can we point them?
Yeah, certainly. So broadbandnow.com/research is where you can find all of our research. You can reach out to me directly anytime you want on Twitter, or also Tyler at broadbandnow.com. Happy to chat anytime.
Perfect. Tyler, thank you again. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Daniel. Always a pleasure.
And thank you, everyone, for tuning into today's episode of Wavelengths. If you like what you heard and saw and you want to tap into previous episodes, make sure you're heading to our website, amphenolbroadband.com. Again, that's amphenolbroadband.com. And make sure that you're subscribing on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. You can find a full catalog of all of our previous conversations, including plenty on BEAD funding. You're definitely going to want to tap into those debates. There's some good ones there. But also, to stay on top of all of our future episodes, again, just hit subscribe on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. I'm your host, Daniel Litwin, the voice of B2B. We'll catch you on the next episode of Wavelengths.